Hi, my name is Tetron Studios, and this is how my friends and I created a full game in only 1 week for the Brackeys Game Jam. If you're unaware of what a game jam is, it's basically a competition where a bunch of game developers come together to try and make the best game on a certain theme in a set amount of time. For this jam, we were given a week, and the theme we had was Calm Before the Storm. And with that, we began brainstorming and thinking about what we could do. But one broad topic stuck out: preparation. Our idea was to make a game that required you to prepare for a big event that was going to happen, like getting guns and ammo ready for a big zombie attack. Of course, that's not what we did, but it was part of the category we were looking at. We brainstormed for around the first hour of the jam, where after 30 minutes we had narrowed it down to 5 different ideas. They were a bakery cooking everything before it opens, a rhythm game preparing vocals for a concert, getting ready for a nuclear winter, grabbing resources to try and survive, getting your car ready for a zombie apocalypse, and a roguelike with waves. And we decided on the first idea mixed with the last idea, a bakery game where you have to make a profit quota before the end of the day. And this is where the jam really began. On day 0? I'll call it day 0 so the last day is day 7. On day 0 of the jam, I worked on making a day and night system. This system was going to be the basis for some of the other systems we would be implementing, so it was important to get this out of the way early. That day, I also got a very basic prototype of a system that showed the players some UI to let them know when the day had started and ended. On this day, Nelmesh Games began to put together the inventory system for the game, which was also another system that a lot of things would rely on, so doing this first was a really good choice and helped us a lot in the future. The Moons worked on the basic player movement and an interaction system so that stoves, ovens and all that good stuff could actually be interacted with. Today, Quirtle Studios, our friend working on art, began drawing the player sprite, and it turned out pretty good, so we decided to use it. We called him Francesco. And as the day began to wither away and we all went to sleep, when we woke up we were filled with ideas and motivation to work on the game even more. On the first day, I worked on the tablet system for the game, which was going to be the way that players could buy items and view the recipes in the game to cook food. Nelmesh Games worked on making the inventory usable by the player, as in the state it was in, the player could hold items but not access them. The Moons worked on a very basic customer. In this state, the customers kinda just walked at a right angle to the location they wanted to go, and we were planning on changing this at some point, but it never happened. The customers could also ask for food, but at this point they would only ever ask for 2 sausage rolls and 1 donut. Quirtle Studios worked on some of the item sprites for the game, and at this point, the game was already starting to form. It looked like the game would be done in these few days, but what would hit us next was totally unexpected. On day 2, I enabled the player to serve customers and also enabled them to order different items, as at that time they only ever ordered 2 sausage rolls and a donut. The main idea of the customers was that they would walk into the store and display a speech bubble to let the player know when they were waiting to tell you their order. Once you retrieved their order, you would need to give them those items in exchange for money. If you don't serve them quick enough, they get impatient and leave the store, but I'll talk about that more later on. On this day, Lamoons and Nelmesh Games made a sink to fill up water, a mixing bowl, and camera transitions. Quirtle Studios worked on drawing the table sprites today, which was super handy to get a basic prototype layout done for the bakery. And as day 2 ended, we looked at each other and said, we can finish this tomorrow, and while this goal may have been unachievable, it would have been great to happen, because the chaos that ensued on the later days really screwed us up. On day 3, we made a fairly good amount of progress, especially due to our time restriction because of school. Here's what I managed to get done. I made some necessary changes to the mixing bowl, as in its stage at this point it was incredibly buggy. It was usable, but half the time it would break and just not work, so I decided to revamp it. I also made it so that customers had a patience level. In day 2, I talked about customers getting impatient and leaving if you didn't serve them fast enough, and that's exactly what I did. I made it so the customers would wait a random amount of time, between a range so they weren't too impatient, and walk out of the store angrily. This new patience system wasn't going to affect the customer rates later on, or decrease the amount they paid you, but it was more enforcing the fact that you had to serve the people that were about to leave first, so it added an extra bit of stress to the storm element of the Calm Before the Storm theme. On this day, Lamoons also made it so that you can collect purchased items during the night from the resource panel in the truck in the morning. Quoodle Studios worked on making a tile map for the game. Currently we just use single PNGs for things, and we converted over to a tile map for convenience. Nulmesh Games worked on some very simple UI to sit in the top right of the screen, as on this day unfortunately he had no free time to work on the game, so he was able to accomplish very little. That was the end of day 3's changes. Now we go on to day 4, where progress starts to drastically slow down. Sorry to disrupt the flow, but I'm currently working on a game called Galactory, where you travel to different planets to expand your factory. If you're enjoying this video, or are interested in that game, please consider subscribing, as it helps out a ton. Anyways, back to the video. On day 4, very little work was done. I changed some things, most notably adding the oven in and changing the amount of stove inputs. The way the oven worked is that the player would be able to place one item that could be baked into the oven. The oven's light would then turn on to let the player know that something is occupying the oven currently, and no more items can be placed in it. Once the item has finished baking, the oven will automatically turn off with the light, and a green exclamation mark will display above the oven to let the player know that the food is done. On this day, not much else was done, except a bunch of recipes were added to the game to allow the player more variation in what they can do in the morning. We also had the ridiculous idea that you were running the bakery due to your nonna passing away from a heart attack during the tutorial, and she passed on the bakery to you for you to run it. The whole bit was that it was comedic and Nonna never actually loved you, and just wished to see you fail in running the bakery, hence the death and win screen messages, but I'll talk more on those later. The last thing that was done today was the Nonna sprite was created for that ridiculous idea I just talked about, and he also began working on Francesco's walk cycle. But even though I said day 4 was slow, it still seemed like something got done. So what could possibly go wrong on day 5? The answer is everything. On day 5, I began work on one thing, the money animation. It was a simple little animation, and it took me no time to make. There was no real issue here, and I whipped it up in about half an hour and hooked it up to the customers to make them use this new animation. Nulmesh Games made some faces appear near the customers to show their current patience levels, getting angrier and angrier as they become impatient. On day 5, Francesco's walking animations were also implemented, which made the game feel a lot more alive. And that's pretty much it for day 5. Nothing else happened for the rest of the day, and this incredibly slow day caught up to us very, very quickly. Day 6 was a big day. After not doing much on day 4 and 5, we realized we had a lot to do, and not much time to do it. We planned for day 6 and 7 to be entirely bug fixing, polishing, and balancing, but that never happened as we still had so many loose ends to tie up to make the game actually playable. And I only realized at this point, you couldn't lose. We had no gameplay loop, and it was only now that we realized. So, we all set to work making the game playable, and I set out to make it so you can lose. The way you progressed to the next day in game was by making a certain profit quota at the end of the day. What this meant was that at the end of the day, you needed to make at least a certain amount of money, and if you didn't meet this quota, you would lose. This quota would increase every day, making the game harder as you progress. So, I worked on adding some UI after the day ended to display to the player whether they had won or lost the game. To add some tension, we made it an intentional design choice not to display to the player how much profit they had earned in a single day, but instead only display how much money they had. This means the player can still determine their profit, but they can't see it at a single glance. I also improved the bakery layout on this day to make the setting feel more alive, because in all the previous states it felt pretty bad and boring. Alongside this, I added a sorting system to the recipe book. This was quite necessary as while playtesting the game, we found out that navigating the recipe book could be quite tedious at times, and being able to sort to see the certain categories was super useful, and boosted the fun factor a bunch. Talking of quality of life, I added some feedback to the truck resources screen to let the player know when they collected an item by showing some text on screen, and also made it so collecting items was much faster and easier. Lastly, I majorly improved the money animation. I made it accelerate, have some more interesting movement, and also rotate the money text upon hitting it to make it look like it just crashed into it. I loved making this as I really love seeing juicy animations for money in games, so this made my monkey brain happy. Apart from that, the rest of the things I did that day were mostly boring, so I won't talk about them here. My changes for day 6 were done, but my team still did loads of other things. On this day, we received the music from Nullmesh, which was to be implemented tomorrow, with 3 different variants for the rush, where customers had an increased spawn rate, in the morning, and during the day when there is no rush. Quaddle Studios made a young sprite for Francesco for the tutorial, as the main idea was that the tutorial was set in the past. And shockingly, by this stage, the game was starting to seem playable, and we had faith that the game could be completed and polished by tomorrow, but we were very, very wrong. Things started to go bad. Today was the deadline. We had about 8 hours to turn a bunch of ingredients into a cake. This wasn't a content grind, it was just time to tie loose ends to make the game fun. So, to begin the day, I immediately got to making the customers have animations, as currently they kind of just hovered over to where they wanted to go. On top of this, we also decided to make the customers feel more alive by having a female sprite. It was quite rushed, so it's not particularly incredible, but it adds a bit of variation to the game that makes it a bit more fun to play and to look at. Right after this, I worked on squashing as many bugs as possible, fixing multiple bugs including a mixing bowl, chopping board, sink, object layering, tablet, and stove bug. I also made a large assortment of UI changes as it looked a bit ugly at this stage. These changes made the recipe book show the value of each item, have a little piece of UI display the item that the player is hovering over in the hotbar, and also the main UI was changed to look a bit cleaner. And at this point we realized we needed the tutorial finished. The problem was, our group member Nullmesh was working on the tutorial, and he was going to be away for most of the day. So, we had 2 options. 1, pray that he had some free time to finish it, or 2, try and decipher the very rushed code and finish it ourselves. And 2 hours before the jam's deadline, we decided to take option 2. And just as we were about to start working on it, the legend showed up. And while Nullmesh finished the tutorial, we were all stressed, yelling at each other and scrambling to get each little thing done before the deadline. Now, was this effective? No, it wasn't. It really wasn't. But 20 minutes before the jam needed to be submitted, we got the really good news. The tutorial was finished. So, we rushed to patch the last few things, and with about 10 minutes left until the deadline, we had a Windows, Mac, and web build on itch. After the stressful week that we had a few minutes of relief. A few minutes to look back and realize we made this game in 1 week. We had persevered, and in the short time frame we had, we'd made a full game. And by no means was it perfect. In most aspects there was a way it could be majorly improved. But we were all proud, we were all tired, but most importantly, we all had a lot of fun. And I want to encourage you to give a jam a go. Even if you're not the most experienced game developer, even if you only know the basics, have a crack at it. You'll have a blast.